Okay.
There
Perfect.
we go.
Hey.
All right.
Followed by the laugh track.
Yeah. So,
I got you covered.
So we're going to go around one more time and do that quick introduction on each of you. I know it's probably a little annoying, but that way hopefully you had time to add any extra details you wanted. So we'll start with you, Kelsey, again. So since you're in person, tell us a little bit about who you are.
What are you doing now?
doing
What's your
now?
experience
Yeah.
been?
Right.
How has it gotten you to where you are today?
Well, my name is Kelsey Boudin, and I am a former journalist. I used to work for the Olean Herald. I started when I was just before my senior year in high school as an intern in the sports department, and all the way through college at St. Bonaventure University. And when I graduated, I became a general assignment reporter out in the newsroom. And a few years later, I became city editor. I think I was the youngest city editor the paper had seen, for what it's worth. But yeah, I was like 25 or something like that. And then my daughter was born, and I could no longer make that work financially. So I moved on to a digital marketing agency and then became a grant writer for a local nonprofit. And then a few years ago, in March of 2020, I started my own business as Southern Tier Communications Strategies, where I do digital marketing and blogging and social media and things like that for small businesses who otherwise wouldn't be able to afford a full-time staff for that, and some nonprofit fundraising things, grant writing for my small nonprofit clients who again otherwise wouldn't be able to afford a full-time staff to do that. So that's been pretty fun. I've had a good time, and it's been a pretty cool trajectory for my career.
Very cool. Very cool. We'll skip over to Josh. Please, once again, give your introduction.
Sure thing. I'm Josh Cradduck. I'm the senior assignment editor at NBC News at 30 Rockefeller Plaza in New York. I've been at NBC for 3 years now. My job mainly entails currently, I've done a variety of shifts. Now my shift is the lead up to the Today Show. So a lot of my job is to make sure the Today Show is up to speed on the editorial across the country. My job is to make sure GMA doesn't have a story that we don't have, essentially, and really help coordinate a lot of the early morning and overnight news gathering on behalf of the NBC News Network for the Today Show and the other platforms like MSNBC, NBC News Now, Telemundo, and all of our local affiliates. So if there's breaking news overnight, I'm the one to make sure it gets on the air, essentially, from a news gathering perspective. One of the many people, but it's kind of my purview overnight to make sure it does happen. Prior to NBC News, I was the assignment manager at Spectrum News in Syracuse, New York. I was there for 12 years. Started there at age 22, right out of college, and stayed up until the early throes of the pandemic. And my job there was to essentially run the assignment desk, hire people on who I thought would benefit the company and benefit our news gathering operation. And do everything from answering viewer phone calls. And if you worked in news at any level, you can attest to how crazy sometimes they can be, all the time. And do everything from those to school closings, to listening to these police and fire scanners. I had 7 police scanners going every day for 12 years. I can barely hear now anymore as a result of that. And really leading the charge and helping lead the charge to make sure our station, from a local perspective, was competing with, obviously, my competitors. So 12 years in local, and then went to Ithaca College, and as I mentioned earlier, news career kind of started back to editing my Washington West Elementary School newspaper. And before that, my grandmother, Jeanette Cradduck, delivered newspapers on horseback in the 1940s and 50s. Whoa. So clearly, that's where I get to.
It's in the blood.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
That's where it starts. But that's me in a nutshell.
Awesome.
I was a reporter on horseback. That's the budget that we had to work with at the Times Herald. I went to Common Council meetings on horseback, for what it's worth.
Pat?
Before I start, Josh, you didn't mention the Emmy Award statuette in your screenshot. Could you tell us about that, please?
There it is. Well, yeah, I was part of the NBC News team that won an Emmy for January 6th coverage. So I was there that day. I remember that day crystal clear. I was not in D.C., obviously. I was in New York, but I can still remember hearing our correspondence on the phone. We had a conference call going, a specials bridge, as we call it, at the network. And when we knew what was happening, quite quickly, we were on the specials bridge. And I remember being on it all night. And when they went inside the Capitol and went inside the House and everything, our correspondents, of course, were in there too. And I recall hearing some of our off-air producers and reporters. I could hear the fear in their voices as they relayed to all of us that, they're inside, and they're like out of breath. And I'm like, what the hell is happening here? So that's what that Emmy is for, is just that I was part of NBC News coverage of that.
Wow. Well, that's impressive stuff.
Yes.
And I wanted to make sure that people who were watching this knew what that statue was for. Congratulations.
Yeah, congrats. That's fascinating, actually. Wow. What a day, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Not hopefully it doesn't happen again.
Yeah.
Oh boy.
How are you going to follow that up?
Yeah.
Yep. I believe we're done.
Whenever you're ready. Pat, please introduce yourself.
My name is Patrick Vecchio, and born here in Olean, grew up here. My journalism career started in 1979 at what was then a daily newspaper, the Salamanca Press, the smallest daily newspaper in New York State. A couple of you have joked about horse facts. When I was writing news stories, the cut and paste function literally involved cutting and pasting pieces of paper together. We had typed our story on manual typewriters. But at any rate, I have 22 years of daily newspaper experience here in Cattaraugus County. I started at the Olean Times Herald in March of '82. I was a general assignment reporter at that time. When I left, I was managing editor. I left in 2001 at the invitation of Lee Coppola, who was the dean of the Jandoli Journalism School at St. Bonaventure University. Lee invited me to teach on the faculty there, and I did so for 15 years, retiring in 2016. And one of the great privileges of my time there was to work with Kelsey in several classes, as he reminded me. Working with young journalists was always a great privilege and a pleasure. And I can say the same thing about being here this afternoon. So thank you.
Thank you, and thank you all for coming and joining us for this.
So kind of you, Pat. Thank you.
Yeah.
He was also my advisor, as we mentioned earlier before coming on.
Is there anywhere we'd like to start, or do we want to just kind of shoot from the hip?
Let's just shoot from the hip. You got something?
Well, so we kind of did a little list of questions ahead of time to be as close to professional as we can get without being professional.
It's overrated. Being professional.
So, you all pretty much touched on what you're doing now and what your previous experience in journalism is. So I'm gonna skip to, and we'll kind of follow the same line again. What made you interested in this field as something to work in? What was your calling to this field of work, as opposed to going and being a mechanic or going in to, manual labor somewhere, or being a scientist, or joining the military? Why journalism of all things?
Well, when I mentioned when I started, I was in high school. And at the time, what I really wanted to, when I was applying to colleges, what I wanted to get into was sports medicine. Just because I played baseball, I loved sports, and, that was just, for whatever reason, it felt like it was a calling to me, but I would have been terrible at that. But it turned out I had some pretty good grades in English. And during one of my baseball games, when I was playing Legion ball in high school, my coach's mother was sitting with my mom and was mentioning that when he was in high school, he had an internship in the sports department at the Times Herald. Just being the guy answering phones, and when the coaches would call in their scores, doing the grunt work and things like that. Yeah. And that just seemed like something, my mom thought that just sounded like something that would be right up my alley. And I was like, oh yeah, absolutely. I could write a little bit, and I enjoyed sports, and it was cool. It was better than having like my, working at like, a grocery store or something. Nothing against anyone who does that. I just really, really liked the opportunity to be writing for a paper when I was in high school. So I don't know. It didn't take long to fall in love with it, to fall in love with being in the newsroom and seeing my name on my byline for the first time. I was like, wow, that is awesome. It was such a profound moment, and it just stuck with me. So when I applied to St. Bonaventure, applied to the journalism school, and basically the rest is history there. I guess that's a cliche. But yeah, just worked on developing those skills through college and continuing with that internship. And along the way, I also had an internship with the Buffalo Bills website, which, that provided some of the digital journalism skills that I was able to gather along the way. So yeah, it was just something that started really young. And I just liked being a professional communicator, and it evolved. That evolved from there. That was powerful.
And speaking of starting young, I know Josh was pretty young when he started connecting with his love for journalism. So
it started when you were a kid, as you said,
grade
right?
School.
Yeah, I still remember my fifth grade teacher pulled me aside and asked if I had interest in working for the elementary school newspaper. I can still remember that moment, and I just had that something inside me that was like, wow, that sounds pretty cool. So yeah, I guess that's technically how it started, and I recently rediscovered a couple copies of it, which is cool that they were still around. I had to buy it on eBay for $100. It's incredible how much they cost. I'm joking.
What a find.
But yeah, so I mean, in theory, that's where I got my start. It technically is Washington West Elementary School in Olean, and so I did that. And I still remember my 8th grade field trip to visit the museum in Washington D.C. That was March 2000. Still remember, and I did the I did the weather. So I'm like, I seeing all these cameras and all these newspapers everywhere. It just was always so fascinating to me. My trajectory in life growing up for me was either take over the family lumber yard. My family owned Olean Lumber. Started by my great grandfather in 1928, passed down to my grandfather on my mother's side, then passed down to my uncles. And my mom worked there. My father worked there. So for me, that was everything in life, was Olean Lumber. But unfortunately, Home Depot came into town. Olean Lumber didn't last much longer. And I kind of thought, okay, well, if I'm not doing that, what else can I do? And clearly I went back to what really interested me intrinsically, and that was journalism. And then I went to BOCES in Olean, a radio television program with John Tomerlin. And that really set me off on the course, because he told me everything about news writing. And when everyone else was interested in making movies and doing commercials and fun things like that, I was, for whatever reason, I could tell instantly that I had a love of journalism. And when we did the little radio newscast, I knew that was it, that this is what I have to do. This is what I want to do. And we did our internship at WSBU Radio at St. Bonaventure. So I was on the air when I was 16 years old at St. Bonaventure, doing the news, doing like ripping and reading, printing a computer copy of the AP, highlighting the salient sections and reading it online, or I'm sorry, reading it over the air when I was 16. So it all kind of slowly morphed. Like it was like this slow buildup from elementary school to middle school to high school. And then obviously in college, I did all you could do in college with, being a reporter and an anchor, a newspaper writer, and so forth. But yeah, it's just always been there. I did not intentionally do it, but I have an old movie poster behind me of a movie starring Humphrey Bogart, Deadline USA, 1950s journalism movie. A great, probably the best journalism movie, other than All the President's Men, in my view. Just something about it. If you know, you know. If you have a passion in life, you know what the feeling is, and mine happens to be this. It's not an easy
Nope, that's me.
field that we all can attest to, but yeah. Anyway, that's not how I got started. It's essentially just slowly from the beginning, building away, and the interest is growing year after year after year. And now this is my 15th year professionally in the business.
Wow. Do we need to do a camera reset?
Nope, just the one, and I got it. We're fine.
That
Didn't realize it was going to be so. Sorry. It scared me.
That's a great story. It's so cool that you were able to identify a passion so early in your career and be able to follow it through.
Can I ask a question? Because
another
thing that I find fascinating, because I obviously would have heard of in like, the school newspaper. I would consider that to be like a high school thing. That's how it was when I was in high school. There was the Rebel Yell at Cuba Rushford. And so it was the high school thing. But I mean, like, I'd never actually heard of an elementary school newspaper, especially, because, and I can see the benefit in that, but I mean, like, putting out a newspaper when a lot of the, the kids are really just developing those very, very basic writing skills. That's very interesting to me that I don't know what the question is, though, other than that exists.
Wow. I mean, I don't want to act. It wasn't, the New York Times. I mean, I have copies I could probably grab in my closet, but it was, it's just a yellow, green, colorful, 2-sheeter, 1-sheeter,
right?
But it was just, my friends and I writing about movie reviews. I did the weather. The article I remember doing was previewing Hale-Bopp Comet and saying, for all your Hale-Bopp Comet coverage, go to NBCnews.com. Just stuff like that.
Wow.
Really
that's amazing.
Really cool. Really
so
cool.
cool.
So Pat, how about you tell us a little bit about what your trajectory looked like?
Well, my gateway into journalism was the comic strip Mandrake the Magician. And I would wait every day for the newspaper boy to deliver the paper, the Times Herald. And the sheets were really big. Broadsheet newspapers back then were quite sizable. And I was 7 years old at the time and would have to spread the paper out on the living room floor and get down on my knees so I could read Mandrake. A lot of stuff in between, but the most pertinent parts of my story were taking a news writing course in college and figuring it would be an easy A because I've always been a reasonably good writer, and I only got a C, and I couldn't understand why the teacher didn't understand why I wasn't a genius. I dropped out of school, and when I went back, I said I want to take another course from this professor just to see how serious I am about this college comeback. And so I took an editorial writing course from him, and at the end of the semester, he said he suggested I go into the field and get an internship the next semester at the Jamestown Post-Journal. And that was pretty much it. I was lucky enough to get a job in Salamanca the month after I graduated from college. And from there, I went to the Times Herald, which I'd grown up reading and always had been interested in it. And started again in '82 as a general assignment reporter, left in 2001 as managing editor. I always had wanted to be, I suppose, editor of my hometown newspaper. But there's the saying, be careful what you wish for. And I think this conversation will drift in that direction eventually today.
Oh, yeah. We'll continue with that because that's some of our next questions. So
why don't we go in reverse order?
We'll go in reverse order now,
and have you talk a bit about that because, one of the points we want to touch on is I think that anybody who lives in, the Olean area who's been around the Times Herald for a long time has seen it turn from a pretty good paper to I don't even know. I don't even know what I would call it anymore.
I think the best way it can be surmised is my entire life, my grandparents were subscribed to it. And for the first time, like a couple of years ago, they canceled their subscription because my grandmother no longer found it worth reading anymore.
Yeah. And I
and that was their whole life before Me Too.
I guess part of what we're wondering is what's your insight on what's the deal? What's happening? Because it's not just happening here in Olean. It's happening to small papers all across the nation, but maybe there's something we can learn from this. So, Pat, if you'd like
Kelsey was there during the most severe bloodletting, I think. I can speak to this in general terms, and I tell people all the time that the problem in our country is not the conservative media, it's not the liberal media, it's the corporate media. And as far as a small local newspaper is concerned, and I think this is true anywhere, the biggest expenses are people and paper. Newsprint, and when corporate people get into a newspaper property, they want to make money, and there's nothing wrong with that. But it seems the trend throughout the industry has been cut, and you simply cannot cut your way to profitability. And the Times Herald has been whittled to the point now where they have the absolute minimum number of people on the editorial staff that allows them to put out a paper every day. And I hear it all the time, and there's nothing in the paper. Well, there's nobody left to find things to put in the paper. It's sad. Again, it's all about profits. It's all about the bottom line, and I can't criticize that at all. If I invested in a newspaper, I'd want to make money too, but it's a different sort of investment than, say, something that's necessary. If you provide a product like medicine, for example, people are going to continue to buy that because they need it. But the news industry has evolved to such a point that it's no longer a necessity. I think the currency in the business locally is local news, and as Kelsey can say, when you don't have the reporters to get the local news, you've got a product that is. I'm sorry, I hate myself for using the word product when it comes to the news. But when you don't have people to write stories to put in the newspaper, you've got something that people like Noah's grandparents are no longer interested in. It's been sad to see, but it hasn't just happened here in Olean. I think the entire industry, for the most part, has gotten the new model of journalism wrong, the model that changed when the internet came into being and people started getting their news there. From there, it's all been kerplooey because people guessed wrong.
Okay, to bounce to Josh, given that your perspective has been much more corporate, I guess, I'll alter the question a little bit. Did the sort of whittling down and winding down process of local press, did that have something to do with your determination that you wanted to go into broadcast journalism instead of print, or was that just a trajectory you had the whole time? And also feel free to talk on the previous subject too.
Yeah, I think so. I remember going back to high school. My teacher in radio television told me, for instance, radio was not the place to go. And he was telling me newspapers aren't the place to go. So this was 2000. I graduated in 04. So this is, there's always been a slow, decline. But this is well before, the past 10 years, let's say, when it really went downhill in terms of the investment in local news. But so that was really, that was kind of an aha moment where he told me, because I had an interest in all three, in radio, in television, and in print. Online news is not really a thing back then that I can recall in terms of having any sort of impact. But so that was the moment where, okay, well, if I'm going to choose any of the three, it's going to be television. So I pursued television primarily, and but yeah, I mean, it's not just Olean, as we've been discussing. It's everywhere. It's places like Syracuse, which is market 80 in terms of television out of the 200 plus markets. So not the biggest, but also not the smallest. And when I started in Syracuse in 2008, just 2 or so years later, one of the local TV stations shut down in merge with another station, eliminating several jobs. And I remember, unfortunately, having to send camera folks to the local watering hole, the bar, where some of these laid off employees were kind of drowning their sorrows after being laid off, and which, of course, you never want to do that. But our instinct was, okay, go find them. What's happening to our competitor here? Because it's a story. It was a storied station, WTVH, shutting down. It's very similar like WKBW in Buffalo. Channel 7 was the station for 3 decades. With Rick Azar and Irv Weinstein and so forth, and Tom Joles. That's no longer a thing anymore. So just in my time in Syracuse, we lost the TV station entirely. The newspaper laid off hundreds of people, went down from 7 days a week printing to like 5 or whatever it is now. They only delivered when I left like 3 times a week to the house. And the radio station went through several cuts. My station went through several cuts. It's unfortunately not new, but it's getting worse. So if it impacts a market like Syracuse, and I've had to see my friends get let go, I've had to see my colleagues get let go, if it's happening there, you can darn well bet it's going to happen in Olean, which is so much smaller, and you really just have the Times Herald, which, I mean, kudos to the people that are still there and working hard to get a product out, but it's certainly not what it was. I remember as a kid sifting through the paper, and it seemed so much bigger back then. And I love journalism history, so I would go back and look at old copies of the Times Herald, and I collect old copies of the Times Herald, and I see how bigger it is, physically bigger, and thicker it was back then. And you have people like Gil Stinger, who were just well-known columnists, and the Fitzpatricks and so forth. So the aura has left, so to speak, I think, from I never worked at the Times Show. I had friends that did. But as a news consumer locally, and every time I go back home, as of last weekend, I still read the paper. So the interest in local news is there, I think. But of course, from the perspective that was talked about earlier, the bottom line is all that matters now. News does not matter to the people that run these organizations, unfortunately, and that's not new. It's just more magnified. That was something Ed Murrow talked about back in the 50s. Was corporate ownership of media, and his producer Fred Friendly talked about corporate ownership of media and what that does. Investment bankers run newsrooms now. It's not you still have families like the Sulzbergers who run the New York Times, but those are unfortunately fewer and far between. And when that becomes fewer and far between, that means the local journalists become fewer and far between, unfortunately.
So, Kelsey, maybe you can follow that up with kind of your time and experience at the Times Herald when it was, going through some really hard changes.
But before I say what I have to say, I have to ask Pat a question from your time when you started in, you said 1982? Mm-hmm. Because to put my experience in perspective, I need to go back and draw an experience that was before my time, unfortunately, because it began then, I would imagine. How many, when you were a reporter there, when you first started, how many reporters were in the newsroom?
Whoa. I would have to actually take the time to go around the desk, make a mental picture of it in my mind, and count the people. I do want to step back to something Josh said a few moments ago. He mentioned the Fitzpatricks, a local family who owned the newspaper. And he mentioned Gil Stinger. There has not been a columnist like Gil since. And Josh said something I thought that was really important. He said, news does not matter to the people who own these papers. And he's absolutely right. And Kelsey, to get back to you, I think you saw that as up close and unpleasant as anybody I know. Mm-hmm.
I do need. Can you estimate the number? I mean, there was in the newsroom there were in Olean, but there was the Allegheny County Bureau. There were reporters out there.
Well, we had 4 people in Allegheny County, in Wellsville. We had 4 people in Bradford. We had a writer in Salamanca, and we probably had 12 writers in the newsroom in Olean, plus sports. And it's funny, the first corporate owners who bought the paper from the Fitzpatricks expanded us from 6 days a week to 7. They added a second business writer, and they added a second lifestyles writer, and they hired another photographer. So not all corporate owners were bad, but geez, Kelsey, we probably had 24 people in the newsroom.
Just news side? I know you mentioned sports, like Chuck and all that. Yeah.
Including sports. Not including the sports interns. There were probably another half dozen of those.
Yeah. So. When I was an intern, I was one of like 10 interns.
Okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And then when I became, I have to be very careful here because I have friends that work there still. And I still, to a certain degree, for some clients, rely on the local media in some perspectives for publishing op-eds and press releases and things like that still have value to them. So I have to be really, really careful with what I say, but I can acknowledge some realities there. When I began as a reporter after college, I was one of, I want to say 6 full-time reporters. So we can see from 1982.
We're already slashed in half.
Holy cow.
Yeah, from 1982 to 2012, we went from 24 to 6. And then there were, there were, I think, 3 full-time sports reporters at the time. So 9. And
Man,
then,
I wonder where all the news went.
And then the news was still there, but we were having a really hard time covering it.
How can you cover it all when you don't have?
So we're looking at 9 and maybe a photographer and a half, I want to say, like a photographer and then like a part-time contractor. So very, very, and that was, we were still operating then. And by the time that I left, we were down to 4 full-time reporters. I was city editor, but I was also our lead reporter, which is also why I was working like 75-hour weeks. I went to the hospital with heart problems at 27. Like that was the stress. That was the stress. Yeah. And also the newspaper news in general is failing to invest in news as the product. When I started as a reporter, I was making $24,000 a year out of college. Just way living at home with my mom at just poverty, but the salaries weren't like that. I wouldn't imagine. I bet you that the salaries when reporters started in 1982 was $24,000, but it went a lot further. I just bought Chuck Massaro's house, Pat. Did you know that? The little general?
Well, I knew he was gone, but I didn't know you'd bought his house.
Yeah. He was another reporter and editor there who was there, very gifted journalist who was there for a long time. And he was able to, when he began there, buy a very nice house.
When you started, you were able to barely live in my mom's house.
So, and the only way that I was even moving on to be like a content producer for a digital marketing agency, and then to become a grant writer for a small local nonprofit, being a content producer in general, it's hard to make ends meet. Even in you might be making around like $35,000, $38,000, $40,000 a year, and which is around the Olean area, that's like median income, which is good, but you're not thriving, it's very, very hard to make ends meet. The only way that I've actually been able to afford a decent living for myself and my family was to break away from the rank and file and literally usher myself to the front of the line to become a chief executive of something. I had to found something and become an entrepreneur to be able to have a decent living. But
Would you have stayed in the field if they paid a little better and didn't end up?
I think I think the decision would have been a lot easier for a lot of us to stay, because there were I was there with some very talented journalists at the time, some Bonaventure graduates and award winners. A lot of us, we won a lot of New York State Associated Press awards in my time there. Like, we were still producing good.
I feel like that's kind of what's really fascinating to me about this is I always felt like, the Times Herald was, for a small town local newspaper, had a lot of really great articles, had a lot of really great writers.
Yeah.
And just kind of watching it slowly deteriorate and bleed out into becoming, well, what's the point of this?
It became an advertising grab by the time that I was leaving. I remember the conversation with the publisher. At that time, there was the Bradford era, the Olean Times Herald, and the Salamanca Press.
Bradford era. Give me PTSD. I'll tell Bradford era. I'll tell it mine.
What's that shadowy place over there? That's the Bradford era, Simba. You must never go there. There were 3 newspapers in Bradford Publishing Company, and this would have been a few months before I left. But this conversation where the publisher brought in the editorial staff, the reporters and photographers and such, and the advertising staff and circulation staff, all of us had like a company-wide meeting, the first time that it ever happened in my 11 years there, to announce that they were purchasing a newspaper in Springville. And I want to say there was another one that they were purchasing in like Ellicottville. I don't know where that ever, it was an advertising grab. And all of us were meant to work that much harder to put out 2 more news. They weren't going to hire any more news staff. They weren't going to hire any more paginators or photographers to cover the news that's happening up there. It was an advertising grab. And I might add, I think that they were a little bit afraid of the Buffalo News coming down and encroaching on our territory, which if Warren Buffett wanted to come down and encroach on our territory, he could.
Yeah, I don't think you would have to worry.
I don't think he's going to care if you have a Springville newspaper, But but that conversation where he was describing that these acquisitions of newspapers and moving in that direction, describing it as building the airplane while in flight. That started my my countdown to leaving. I was gone within 4 months because
where's the parachute?
Because there was no way that was going to be sustainable, and it wasn't. It ultimately turned out not to be. But they were just investing only in advertising. We need more ad reps. We need more people gathering that revenue rather than just, people read Christopher Michelle. He was a great reporter. He was a great city reporter. He covered, and other reporters that we had at the time, including myself, we're what sold the paper. And we were never invested in that way. And it was really, really unfortunate that it was like that because we were worth so much more. And to answer your question, yeah, if we were offered a competitive salary, not $24,000 a year, but a competitive salary, I think the decision to stay would have been a lot. We were in the industry for a reason. We cared for it, Right. And I think
there's a level of integrity there that I feel like has always been there that isn't there anymore.
Yeah. It wasn't even just a calling to me like, hey, I really need to be doing this. I felt it like my civic duty to be a good journalist. So I think that we would have definitely made the decision to stay a lot easier had they chosen to invest in their people the right way.
And that's one of the big mysteries about journalism is when you're in journalism school, you think you're going to go and make $100,000 right out of college. As I did, I'm like, oh, okay, well, I'm going to make it the big time. I'm going to make a lot of money and get a house and everything. I started at 22 a year in Syracuse back in '08. And if you remember in '08,
yeah.
Great recession. Gasoline, I still remember filling up to drive to Syracuse for my job interview. Gasoline at Country Fair near 13th Street was in the $4 range.
I remember that.
So it was '08. It was Great Recession. It was $4 plus gasoline. The economy in September of that year when I started my job was cratering, so to speak. And they started me at $10.10 an hour, 22 a year. Taking this big picture, it's not sustainable at all. And a lot of local journalists leave for that reason. It's just, I'm not saying, journalists and reporters, we are, firefighters breaking into burning buildings here. But at the same time, we are asked a lot of, and we work outrageous hours, work holidays, work overnights, work weekends, and do so for decades. And you are not really, on the grand scheme, compensated for such. So that's one reason why people flee this business. And a lot of good reporters flee this business it's not really sustainable. I'm not, trying to, to knock the industry, obviously, since it's still employed by it, of course. But that's just one of the myths that I thought I'd throw in there is that a lot of college students, as soon as they are going into the business, as soon as they get in the business, there is like this cold pail of water thrown on them, and they're realizing that, you are moving from apartment to apartment, city to city, slowly getting a pay raise. And local reporters are not compensated and don't get the benefits that you think they would for the work they do because, like Kelsey mentioned, 75-hour weeks, heart problems. I have like 4 cups of coffee, a black coffee a day.
That's the only way to keep going.
Exactly. So that's how you survive. That's how you, quote, thrive. But that's just one thing I was going to throw out there it's not to sound, woe is me, but the benefits as a local reporter that you get, they're not really there. I mean, you're not nowadays certainly buying a house, or living in a posh Manhattan penthouse. That's not the case, unfortunately.
I would not want to be, well, it seems I've read someplace, and it may have been Harper's Magazine, not the current issue, but the previous issue, that said that 9 out of 10 people who had majored in journalism in college regretted their choice, which to me was like taking a mallet to the head. But if I were one of those 10 who did not regret my choice, I'm not sure I'd want to go into the business today simply because of the disregard that journalists are held in by society in general. It was a mean business when I was in it back in the 80s and 90s, and today I just can't imagine what it's like. Josh, do you see much of that? The hostility manifested toward people who are trying to be honest and fair and ethical about their work?
Absolutely. I mean, it's how many times I've gotten phone calls saying, screaming, "You're fake news. Why are you doing this to so and so?" And that was before the current political tumult. It's always been a thing. Everyone always hates the media, whether it's local media or national media, or you're too liberal, you're too conservative. And frankly, if you get everyone saying you're too liberal, you're too conservative, you must be doing something right, because both sides don't like you. But this business is, you go and not to be loved, but to try to be fair. But that does catch up with you, on a personal level. You go on Facebook or whatever, and you see the even from people kind of trashing the media. It's sad that it has become such a buzzword, and sad that it's become a point where sometimes you're afraid to say where you work, and particularly in more rural areas. If I go back to Western New York, there's a good chance I'm not going to wear my NBC News jacket to the grocery store, because I don't want to get punched. It used to be a thing of pride. I remember I had one of those Facebook memories pop up, or 10 years ago, I went to a gas station to fill up my car, and I had my news jacket on, and somebody pulled me aside and said, "Oh, I see you on TV." I'm like, "I'm sorry, I'm not an on-air personality." He's like, "No, I see you walking in the background." And that's a true story. I'm like, "Wow, that's great. I felt like a celebrity." I signed his gas muzzle. Not really. But it was such a feeling of pride, like, wow, to be recognized. And I proudly wore my news jacket. I wore it out. I wore it to stores. And slowly, over the past couple of years, I'm like, I don't think so.
The hassle.
That'd be dangerous now.
It is. It's very dangerous now. It's sad that's, and again, it's not new. It goes back forever. It goes back, you could say Nixon, really demonized the press. And I remember at, I don't know what testimony was given in D.C., but Daniel Shore was saying, to the point where the Richard Nixon administration was making it as if being a newsman was not a noble profession anymore. And it's certainly just been amplified over the past couple of years. And it's you take pride in it internally, but it's the point where you don't really want to mention that around certain people that you work for local media, national media. I think my mom told one of her friends that I worked at NBC News, and the response that he gave her was not, "Oh wow." It was, "Well, we won't hold that against him." It's like you work your
liberal scum.
Yeah.
That's a true story. You work your whole life out. You work, 60 hours a week on 4 hours of sleep every day to do what you think is good. That's educate and inform your colleagues and your family and the public at large. And the response is not met with a, "Well, great story." It's met with a, "How dare you?" And that's not always the way it is, but that's certainly a large part of it.
Given that your perspective you're one of you belong to one of the three pillars of cable news, I'd say, in today's age: CNN, NBC, and Fox. Given that, sure, demonizing the press has been around forever, but like in your own words, in recent years, particularly the last decade and some change, it's gotten a little bit worse. Public confidence has almost waned further down. I mean, some recent polling shows it at the lowest it's ever been. And viewership in recent years seems to be reflecting that too. People are starting to turn off their cable boxes. Given that you have a more, an inside perspective, what does that what is your estimation as the cause of that, and how is it being treated or looked at by your colleagues over at NBC?
I think, our goal is still what it was, because where I work at the network side is I don't technically work at MSNBC. We're still all, a large family owned by NBC Universal, but I'm on the network news gathering side. So my goal day in, day out is the news gathering operation, and to accommodate live shots for our many correspondents around the world and around the country for MSNBC, for NBC News Now, and our bread and butter, which is the NBC Nightly News, the Today Show, and so forth. So our goal really, and this is true, is we're so busy on a day in and day out basis, doing news gathering and coordinating who gets on what network and so forth. I don't know that we have big discussions and think a lot about that in the sense of, the ratings or whatever, because our job is primarily go in there and it sounds so cliche, but do the best we can and gather as much news as we can across the country to make sure we bring a better that we're a better resource than ABC would be, or CBS would be, or CNN or whatever. But it's always in the back of everyone's mind that, even looking at the network newscasts, it's not going to bring in 10 million people like a Tom Brokaw newscast would have done 15, 20 years ago. It's not, the big three are gone, Dan Rather, Peter Jennings, and Tom Brokaw. And with regard to the fact that it was network and appointment television, I remember, going back to when I was a kid, which wasn't that long ago, but it was, the 90s and early 2000s. And even then, I wanted to make sure to watch at 6:30 NBC Nightly News with Tom Brokaw. That's one of the reasons I got in this business, because I saw that zoom up the GE building and heard the music of John Williams and heard the voiceover of Howard Reed and saying, "Here's Tom Brokaw." And it seemed like the most important thing in the world to watch that. And that's the way it was throughout the history of television. It was appointment television. That's not there anymore. That's why companies are now catering to everywhere television, everywhere content. It's on your phone. It's on your phone. It's on your laptop. It's not sitting down in front of a box and having some guy in New York tell you what's going on for half an hour. It is all the time. It's all over the place. So, we as a network and the cable channel MSNBC and the others like CNN and Fox and so forth have to keep up with that.
Wow, the perspective is just so. I guess Kelsey, we'll shift to you for a second.
Can we do the laugh track first?
Yeah. Well, kind of following that up, we're gonna kind of circle back around and kind of give like an autopsy. Each of us give it like a current autopsy on the state of local media, and we might rehash some of the topics we've touched on already, but what we think as individuals who've been in the field needs to change in order to either revitalize it, or what's the next natural evolution for getting information into the hands of people on a local level.
Local.
Particularly
local, regional.
This area where we all come from seems to be suffering, and as local news is deteriorating, national news can't necessarily fill in the needs of reporting on the events of the day in Olean, New York, or Allegheny, or Portville, or Ceres, or wherever. However, we all know, you visit any library in any of these towns, you can go through just every newspaper clipping that's ever been printed in that town ever.
Right.
It's important. We know it's important, but we're not getting it. How can we try and bring it back, or is it too far gone at this point?
Well, it's
what form does it take on?
Or what form does it take now? Yes.
I really wish that I could put my thumb on the pulse of that. I do. It's not gone. It's not entirely dead. It's damn close.
It just smells funny.
It smells funny. It's damn close to dead. And it's a shame, because the local and regional media is very important for holding people in power accountable. I mean, and like power used very loosely, because I don't like, the mayor of Olean is not a powerful man, but he is a
But relative to the city of Olean,
he's a powerful man.
Figure.
Yeah, he's a powerful figure. He determines things. He and the council, determine things that are happening with your tax dollars on a local level, and that's happening in all of these towns around here and villages. And
if there's no news to report on it, where does that information go?
I mean, like, for what it's worth, I remember doing like little tiny blurbs on the town of Hinsdale spending $75,000 on 7 tons of rock salt for the winter. I mean, that was, for what it's, that at least showed that, where the tax dollars were going, and more or less, on larger scales, like the city of Olean, their $35 million budget and what that's going toward, and the school district's $35 million budget or more. It was like 35 when it's probably like closer to 50 now. But with the fall of traditional newspaper journalism and traditional local media in general, you're missing that. And there are things that are there. There's the tap into Olean, digital news media that is attempting to cover things on a local level. And I can't speak with enough expertise on what they are doing to know if they're doing that effectively. I know that that's pretty much the only route that you can go for something like that. I mean, you could have go
to the Olean Times Herald website if you pay for a subscription.
If you pay for a subscription, sure. I mean, but yeah, and maybe there needs to be people who are actually willing to pay for that. I mean, like, you have to pay for that. It's a service, but because people got so used to getting news for free, getting it delivered right to their phones and devices, that paying for news became less palatable. Which also kind of created that vicious cycle of, well, we're not getting the revenue this way, we have to bump up in advertising, and then everything became an advertising grab. So I guess to answer the question, I don't know what can be done. I think there are things like Tap Into that are that are a valuable resource. I don't know if there is. I don't know if they're as powerful, or if they could improve to cover news the way it once was covered locally. I don't know. I really.
How about we toss it to either Josh or Pat, whoever wants to go next.
Well, I would just like to follow up on something Kelsey said earlier, and he was talking about when he was working at the paper with Chris Michelle and some other writers, and I would see Kelsey's byline and I would see Chris's byline and I would read it. Well, reporters like that are gone, and I think they are down to 2, maybe 3 full-time reporters at the Times Herald. I don't think they can go with fewer reporters, but they're not going to add any because people cost money. And again, if I were an investor in a paper that has the financial standing of the Times Herald, I'm not sure I would want to spend money to double the news staff anyway. So what's going to happen? A couple of things. Maybe an online competitor is going to come in along the lines of what John Anderson has done over in Wellsville with the Wellsville Sun. And I've been talking with people who want to form an online newspaper in Olean. I can't say too much about that right now. But for the Times Herald to survive or grow, let's put it that way, for the Times Herald to grow, they need to completely rethink what they're doing. 5 days a week is too many newspapers for a community this size and for a news staff this size. And they need to be smarter about the stories they're covering. A couple of weeks ago, there was a story in the paper based largely on a press release from Senator Chuck Schumer about how there was the possibility that Olean General and other regional hospitals would be getting all these millions and millions of dollars in aid. And I think the figure for Olean General was $24 million. Okay, that sounds like good news. The logical follow-up story is to contact the chief financial officer or the CEO of the hospital and say, in the grand scheme of things, how much is $24 million? Because there are few more universal issues in American life today than health. And when it comes to looking at that on a local level, you're looking at the state of the local hospital. I would like to have known. No, I would like to know now. How much is $24 million? Is this happy days are here again at Olean General? Is this okay? It's a good start, but we need more.
Is it a Band-Aid on a broken arm?
That story was not done.
Yeah. Wow.
That story was not done. There was a classified ad, a display ad in the classified section here last week, advertising for an administrative position, administrative vacancy in the Olean School District. I was wondering, is this a current position? Is this a new position? How much will it pay? If it's a current position, why is the person leaving? All kinds of unanswered questions. That story was never done. There was just a local blurb the other day on the paper about, support your local food pantry. And it was written by somebody who is involved in food pantries for a social services agency in Salamanca. The story did not give us any contact information about the local food pantries. If I had wanted to support them, how would I have done so? That information was not there. And news, a newspaper that the content is composed largely of barely rewritten press releases. And Kelso, I know you do press releases, and there's nothing wrong with them. And I've done some of that writing myself. But those are not the stories people are talking about. The people are talking about stories that involve major issues in their lives, and with a little imagination and with a little curiosity and with a little initiative, 2 or 3 reporters could dig those stories out. But that kind of work does not lend itself to being published 5 days a week. So the whole local newspaper model, in my opinion, has to be completely rethought. It has to be completely reimagined. The old ways are no longer good enough. New ways are going to have to come about. And if I sound like I'm a little wound up about this, I am, because I believe if you tell people what's going on, what it means, and why it matters to them, there is a hunger for those stories. People want to know those things. People need to know those things, and they're not finding them out by press releases about yeehaw days in the town of middle of nowhere, Cattaraugus County.
I didn't want you to. I didn't mean for you to get fired up, but I knew you would, and that's part of the reason I wanted you here, because I know that this is something you're passionate about, and I wanted that.
I'd be fascinated, Steve, to hear if you guys have conversations on this, like the state of local media in your household, if Pat is ever around, or if you're at like a family event or something.
I don't know. I feel like maybe that's something we've maybe touched on once or twice, maybe driving to a concert or something.
Right.
No, but Stephen gets scared when I start to talk like this, and I only got ramped up to about 50 miles an hour. He's probably better off not seeing me when I'm foaming at the mouth and spittle is flying all over the place.
See, I'm not scared by that. I'm fascinated by it, because I remember these conversations in your office, when we'd have our advisement sessions. So that's yeah.
Josh, you got anything to add to any of that?
No, I think a very important point was touched on, and that's the desire to read local news is still there. Just because Olean's, shrinking in size, as are every other city, it feels like in Western New York or anywhere USA, it does not mean the appetite for local news goes away. It's not. People still want to read what's happening. It's a human desire. What's happening over there? They want to know what's happening, and that's always going to be there. There's always going to be that insatiable appetite to find out what's happening, and that the idea to inform people on things they don't know that are happening is another reason for journalism. And like mentioned, if no one's reporting on the fact that $75,000 was being paid for on rock salt or whatever the case might be, that's an important function of the media that's potentially going away. So news is what people want to hear, but it's also what they need to hear. And when you cut staff or staff is low at any newspaper or radio or television station, that valuable arm of the press goes away. And it's now potentially reduced to writing up those press releases. But yeah, that's the important part is people of Olean and people in Cattaraugus County and anywhere still want local news. And they can get it through their local paper and local radio in a way that a place like a network cannot cover. I put on Twitter this morning, it's kind of a joke, but this morning at around 6 or so in the morning, I lined up a lot of we call them bump shots. So it's Friday before Memorial Day weekend. So the Today Show opened up with a variety of travel cameras from Orlando to Texas to Houston to Pittsburgh. And as a joke on Twitter, I threw in the Olean webcam. Because I can't really sell the Today Show and putting the Olean New York webcam up, but because I still love my hometown, I threw it in there as a joke. But so I can't talk NBC News into covering something out of Olean unless it's really big. I'm very happy we do go to Syracuse a lot, and I kind of, because I used to work there, push for Syracuse stories and Buffalo stories when I can at the network level, because it's very much a lot of things happening here that just don't get the attention because of our size. But that's where the local media comes into play, because that desire is to know what's going on is always going to be there. It's never going away. It's just a matter of how people are going to get that, and that's always been the case. There's always newspapers shutting down. There's always going to be newspapers merging, radio stations being shut down, TV stations being shut down, restarting, rebooting. Journalism is very much a technology-based business. Where technology goes, we all go. And that impacts the employee of hundreds of thousands of people. And where it goes from here, who the hell knows? But anyway, no matter the device that is delivered, whether it's a physical piece of paper, which I still love, whether it's in your earbuds, or whether it's scrolling through your phone on a train, or whether it's turning on your TV, whether it's national, local, that desire to know is really always been there, and it will always be there.
Josh, I just want to follow up on something you said earlier. And before this event this afternoon, I did not know your family had been involved in Olean Lumber. And you mentioned what happened to them after the Home Depot came in. And there's a perfect example, I think, of a local story that got overlooked. What does it mean when a local company with deep roots in the history goes out of business? And that's a story that's pertinent, I think, to people who don't know you, who don't know your family. X amount of employees are out of work. You are losing a vital part of the fabric. You are the businesses that people went to, Cub Scout packs, little leagues, whatever, when they were looking for donations. There are just all these again, I'm repeating myself here, these roots that a business has in the community, and everybody thinks, okay, well, Home Depot, we can get all this stuff, but there's a price for it. And in a society where our mercantile system is becoming increasingly owned by large corporations, I think that is a story that needs to be told. I think that's a story people would want to hear, they would be interested in, and I think a medium that traffics in those stories and those kind of stories would be attractive to advertisers because they know people are reading them. And I apologize if I've touched on something in your family history that may still be a little raw, but you've got a family there and they're hurting because of this, and those stories need to be told, I think.
This is the stuff that affects us, the small town people in the small communities.
Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, we're getting close to wrap up time, but before we do, I wanted to get one more round of questions, and that is more, I say fun, but it's more. It can go one of two ways depending on whether you want to go fun or dark with it. But we'll start with Kelsey.
Let's go dark.
Given that you've all dabbled in the field of journalism and reporting,
I think it's a little more than dabbling.
Yeah. What's the story that sticks out to you most that you've reported on or been a part of?
That would probably be one of the court cases that I covered in Little Valley in Cattaraugus County Court. There was a woman from Salamanca who had been prostituting out her young daughter in exchange for booze and drugs. Not even exchanging money, just for that.
Wow.
That was haunting. And I remember after she was found guilty, she was sentenced to like 47 years in prison.
Yikes.
Yeah. And her daughter testified, and she was, much older, as time goes by, and it takes a long time for those things to get to trial. The woman chose to represent herself in court, and she was there. The court appointed an attorney just to stand by, just in case, she completely was dropping, which she was dropping the ball, but I guess that was her choice. But there was something haunting about the fact that this woman, who quite clearly did this, thought that she was the best and brightest in her own world to be able to mount her defense in court like that. And she's just, for lack of a better term, just complete trash, of a human being. And she looked the part too. And I remember writing a column after the fact, after she was found guilty, and sent to prison. And it was called "And There She Was, a Monster." And that really stood out to me. That is the most powerful thing that I covered. I covered a lot of court cases and murder trials and things like that, but that one really, really stands out, the prostitution one.
Wow. Yeah. Josh, how about you?
I'm having difficulty pinpointing just one, but it just, there's a certain number of stories that jump out at you. There was one of my first big stories. My first job was 8 people. This is going to take a dark turn, unfortunately. 8 people killed in a fire in Richland, New York, in Oswego County. And at the same time, somebody was 4 people were shot at a house party in Syracuse. And I remember simultaneously this morning, or that morning, getting police information, talking to Syracuse Police PIO about information about the 4 people shot and killed, while simultaneously orchestrating our coverage of the 8 people killed in a fire. That was January 2009. I remember a megabus crash in Syracuse happened early Saturday or Sunday morning, where 4 people were killed when a megabus had its top sheared off when it hit the Parkway Bridge. Missing person cases, stuff like that. Really, it hardens you to a really sad business. Unfortunately, I can't tell you how many murders and fires and car crashes and plane crashes I've had to send crews to, and I've had to get details of over the phone. And after a while, it just kind of, unfortunately, you have to have a tough exterior because it's so bad. But there's always fun stuff. At my last job, I was the coordinator of our state fair coverage. So for 9 years in a row, for 12 days straight each year, I was coordinating our fair coverage, which is always a fun thing. Trying to get Schumer to come over, trying to get the local B-Act concert that they would line up. So I don't know, that's one particular story. It's just, a series of dramatic stories locally that I always remember. I remember once there was a manhunt for a man who shot and killed like 3 or 4 people in Herkimer. And then simultaneously, while the manhunt was going on, we were in continuous coverage. And then at the same time, they, over the Vatican, chose a new pope. The white smoke was billowing from the chimney. So we literally had a split screen. We were organizing coverage for the manhunt, meanwhile showing the fact that, oh my God, there's a new pope. And I remember being in the newsroom thinking to myself, this is great, because we got a freaking manhunt going on, and we got a new pope being chosen. Like, this is why you get into the business. And it was just glorious. I mean, not for the manhunt. I mean, obviously that's terrible, but I mean, come on, it's beautiful television. So it's now, I can't pinpoint one story, but it's just, a lot of stories along the way. January 6th, you always remember that. And I remember when Pope John Paul II passed away, writing a follow-up article for my college newspaper. And then years later, when Pope Benedict was selected, I remember thinking, where am I going to be when the next pope passes away or gets selected? And I remember waking up the next morning to the news that Pope Benedict was abdicating, and then thinking about at that point, okay, where am I going to be when the next pope is passes away or is added on? And then New Year's Eve, I was working the network desk overnight, and there I was. Pope Benedict passed away, and I was the one that sent out the internal page to the entire network team saying Pope Benedict has passed away at 2 a.m, whatever time it was. So, not one story, but a series of stories that you will always remember.
Oh, great answer. And Pat, what about you?
It was 1979. I was out of school. I'd been out of school for maybe 4 months, and it was down in Salamanca, and a fellow ran a red light. And so there was a sheriff's deputy, the sheriff's son, as a matter of fact, and an off-duty corrections officer, if I'm remembering this correctly, gave chase. The man drove his car down by the dikes in the middle of the city of Salamanca, got out and started running, and the sheriff's deputy shot him. Fortunately, he only grazed his ear. I would stop at the Salamanca Police Department on my way into work every morning and read the blotter. And that morning, a lieutenant on the police department called me into his office and shut the door and told me I might want to look into this situation because the sheriff's department likely was not going to have it in their daily report. So we had about 3 hours to track the story down. It involved a colleague and myself. We did some pretty original thinking, I get, to develop sources. And we had the story that afternoon. And just the idea that here we are in this little smallest daily newspaper in the state, as I said, and we broke a story that beat everybody. All the local or all the Buffalo TV stations had this story as soon as they could get their hands on it. The Times Herald had their hands on the story as soon as they could get it. But we beat everybody. And for a kid who'd been out of school, out of college for 4 months, it really it was why you got into the business. Now, I should point out that in Salamanca City Court, the deputy was cleared of everything but a minor charge. I don't think any disciplinary action was taken against anybody. But still, the story was as we reported it, and to the best of my knowledge and recollection, true. Josh said something earlier, and I'd be curious to hear Kelsey's reaction. I remember this. Kelsey writing about that particular trial, and I think people think that journalists are uncaring, callous people, and there were stories that I would write them when I would finish up. I would go home and pour a glass of single malt and just cry. I mean, you can't believe some of the things you see, and it's a tough business, as Josh said. It hardens you. And when we see just how hard we have gotten sometimes, speaking for myself, I didn't like the person I'd become.
I can agree with that. I can definitely agree with that. Yeah. I mean, not only did I need to get out for my own health and to, be able to raise my, raise my family, but, yeah, it does harden you in a way. 'Cause that was just one trial. I mean, like I had gotten a reputation because I started just being the person who took on covering like the murder trials and things like that. Basically by being the person who wanted to do them because I was hungry enough to do those stories as a younger reporter. And as rare as they come up in this area, you might have a murder once every couple of years in Olean or something. And, maybe once every 10 years out in the outlying areas but there were, over the course of my time there, I covered like 6 or 7 of them. Mm-hmm. And each one of them terrible in their own distinct, unique way. And each one of them kind of takes something from you. One of them was a shaken baby case, also in Salamanca. Mm. Yeah. And she was, I believe, 14 months old when the baby died from that. So each one of them takes something from you. I feel better now, you know. But having seen some of those
See some
things,
awful shit, don't you?
yeah, absolutely. I mean, like to the point where, you know, it's someone could drop a dead body on this table right now, and I probably wouldn't have too much of a reaction to it other than, hey, that's a dead body, you know. So, and that's not an exaggeration. It does that to you.
Absolutely. I remember once listening to the police scanner and hearing a trooper scream at the top of his lungs about a man who had a shotgun, this is getting dark, to a baby. And he was screaming about that. And I'm like, oh my God. So, you know, you at that moment put that aside and say, I got to get somebody there. What are the logistics here? How do we get them there? You worry almost about the confirmation of that awful detail later, but it's like, okay, the primary focus is to get somebody there, get it covered so folks know what's going on. But you have to put that as a news person in the back of your mind quickly, pack it away, because you don't have time to ruminate over that. You don't have time to think about that emotion of what you actually just heard. And, you know, you just pack it up and you move on. But, you know, it's absolutely true. It's, you know, you become almost desensitized because of the day in, day out dreck that you hear. And, you know, it's, you know, you hear stuff like that on a police scanner, you see stuff like that in person, and it just desensitizes you. And you just kind of have to say, okay, what's next? But I think that's the healthiest way to do it, at least in my experience, is to not think about it. Just, it's terrible, it's horrible, but what's the next item on the agenda that folks need to know about? I think that's the only way to stay sane and healthy, if that's even possible in this business, is to take what you hear, think about how to cover it, what are the implications, and then move on because there's something else out there. But yeah, definitely has an impact.
There's just another one waiting tomorrow.
And God bless you for still being in it.
Absolutely.
You know,